Hey everybody, how you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy and Plato's Republic, specifically Book 2 from the Book 1. Please watch my last talk on the Republic and Book 1 of it, and the other videos on Greek philosophy as well as Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, and all the other stuff. So, last time we had that Plato is turning from his early Plato to mid-later Plato, and we know this because he is taking Socrates, his famous character, an actual guy, but here in Plato's dialogues and plays his character and mouthpiece, and he has gone from being a bit more Heraclitus question everything, who knows anything, we just push and tarry upward towards the gods and the good, which is very Heraclitus, but then you have mid and later Plato say actually being so skeptical is not so nice, and you have several people upset with Socrates in Book 1 of the Republic, many leave, some stay, and the interlocutors, the back and forther arguers who say, hey, we're going to stick around and give a better idea of this, Socrates now continues to lecture at everyone in rather Pythagorean and somewhat Parmenidean ways, and then they fall asleep, they wake up the next morning, and hey, here comes a Pythagorean named Timaeus, and the Timaeus, which I do enjoy and I think should be always paired with the Republic, is my opinion since grad school and wasn't before that, in which I studied Buddhism, Platonism, and other forms of human historical thought, which I'm happy to say I can tell to you in hopefully the simplest and silliest of ways. And one of those things in there is that Plato turns towards something like Pythagoras, and we can see this clearly when we actually read the Timaeus and include it as one of the most important texts to Muslims and Christians of the Middle Ages, very much their physics, in which Plato says vegetation's kind of the hair of the world, oddly. But in there, we basically have Plato saying that, hey, take it away Pythagorean, and then a Pythagorean very much tells us a whole lot about our cosmos. So Plato is now arguing for an eternal form of the good. Now, we've had Socrates say push towards the good, push towards the good, but he has not said, so what's the form of the good? And now he starts to say the form of the good, and he gives it a tripartite Trinitarian form. And by the way, Pythagoras sees the 10 in the Tetractys pyramid triangle. Technically a triangle, one side of a pyramid, yes? In which there's 1, 2 is 3, and then you have down 2, and then you have 10. Which I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4 makes 10. In a triangle. So Plato is going to describe how the self, the cosmos, which the self, mind, and body all together, and he does represent it as, it seems, organs up the body. The best evidence for this is in the Timaeus, like the organs in your body, the stomach, the heart, and mixed up with the lungs and breath, and mixed up with your head. You need to see this, especially before the cave, because the cave is something like a body and then a mouth, and then you have the higher light and the sun above the cave and things. Those simple analogies or simple forms would not be lost on Plato at all when we read the Timaeus afterwards, which is the next day conversation, hey, take it away Pythagorean, that he's arguing for a form of the good that looks like the stomach, the heart, and the head match the workers. We don't really talk about the slaves or other folks. The workers, people who make buckets and do crafts and things. You then have the warriors and the cops, the police. And then you have, who are the army, warrior, cop, and army all together inside, outside the city-state, taking care of the inside and the outside all together, and that where we have a division in America specifically between the cops and the military. That is, in fact, that's come into the news occasionally lately, but that is, they're all the same for Plato in the ancient world. The soldiers are the cops of the city. And then you also have the intellectuals, who are the scientist, philosopher, Egyptian priestish people, which Plato says we should imitate the Egyptian priests plenty in the Timaeus. And I think he does say that essentially in the Republic here and there, as we'll get along to. And he essentially says, yeah, we should have the priests as our solar betters here, and we should have the intellectuals and the philosopher kings, as it's often translated, ruling society. And then we have downward order where they tell the police what to do, and then the police police the citizens and the citizenry and the stomach. He very much makes analogies like this, and you can see the 3s and 3s and 3s in the Timaeus, and that is very Pythagorean, and Timaeus is a Pythagorean and called so in the text. Apparently there was a Timaeus, he was a Pythagorean, and he is Plato's character like Socrates, who was also a real guy in the text. I won't say Socrates was a Heraclitean, but Socrates goes from being something very like, if not a Heraclitean, to somebody who starts lecturing us for the rest of the Republic, much in Pythagoras, a bit of Parmenides, and then take it away Timaeus in the next dialogue, and Socrates actually shuts up for most of the time. So that is evidence here from onward, and I will describe and then go onward in the next talk with the Timaeus on how Plato is describing what you can see in Indian thought and Kundalini, that you represent organs of the body and elements of the cosmos as very basic pieces, often represented with basic shapes, like fire is a triangle, like a pyramid of light going down in Egypt from above and from the sun. That fire is a triangle, earth is rather square with little cubes of sand in Egypt and along the coast of Greece, etc., and rock formations which are rather square, man. And you would have basic representations of something like stomach is earth, fire, air is something, you have air, and breath is something in the chest. You can see it physically, and then fire is in the mind, which is how you can think of your great Aunt Prudence, and then yes, and stop right there. So you essentially have the just city is a threefold caste system, which I collected books back in the day. People in the 70s and onward have mentioned, this is weirdly like India and the caste system. And then when I was younger, I was like, ooh, what if this is Plato bringing the caste system of India into, and that was not lost on Aldous Huxley. If you ever read Brave New World, Aldous Huxley is a Brit who was saying, in the 50s and 60s, hey, look at Plato in India. So people were around Aldous Huxley and people he was listening to drawing these comparisons then, before the 50s and 60s, etc., that you have people very clearly here showing that, and we sort of don't even pay much attention to it nowadays, even in academia, I have to say. I sadly run into folks all the time, and they're like, what do you mean India and Greece are similar in this way? If we don't have Indian philosophy taught in universities a lot, then these connections, I have the books, and it's decent scholarship, but it is speculation like philosophy, and if we don't pour money on that, we don't really figure all that out very much as a civilization, do we? Unfortunately, I have students every year who's like, wow, the Babylonians can think. I don't know if it's getting better or not. And like this, in the 70s, there were people who made these connections, said, wow, Plato's Republic is like the Indian caste system, so much with the organs and with the shapes and with other things like that. As mentioned, and often like to say, I learned in grad school, Tibetan stupas are shaped with those symbolic shapes and elements because they're showing you the periodic table, lightest to heaviest of elements. I go on and on about this, as you can tell. This, with the Republic and the Timaeus, is the time to go on and on about it because you are seeing ancient physics go on, and we just disregard it and we don't read the Timaeus. It's like, oh, none of that's important right now. Plato's interesting because he talked about a republic occasionally, even though he was far from a democrat in the slightest. And Aristotle's like, really, you should get a great king, like Alexander, his patron. Yes, why wouldn't he say that? Whether or not he believed it, I'd keep it in line, So, keep your ducks in a row, as it were, with the Republic. I often say keep your ducks in a row in the Republic a lot. Because basically Plato is saying put your mind over your chest and your heart over your stomach. He is unquestionably saying that. And then in the Timaeus, by the way, that's the order of the elements, and we don't want to storm when the elements get out of balance. Why can't a tyrant, we were asked by Thrasymachus, Marcus, and he basically says, well, why not the tyrant? Why not might makes right? Well, the answer is because your ducks aren't in a row. And why aren't your ducks in a row? Well, for the rest of the Republic and the day after, we get Pythagorean answers about elements and your stomach, your head ruling your heart, ruling your stomach, which is the intellectual philosopher Egyptian priests ruling the warriors, cops, the police, polis, of the city-state polis, where we get the name in the polisi. And then you have over the stomach and the workers. And Plato is not a very top-up guy. We in American history, it's like you need bottom-up also checks and balances. Really, the checks and balances come downward for Plato. Pretty much, and we'll get more into why that's a thing as we get through this text. So again, you have kind of the unmentionables and then the three higher above the unmentionables, kind of like India, oddly. But that again would not necessarily be, as I thought when I was younger, that's India coming into Greece, as I started to mention. That is probably actually, there's a lot of culture crossing around in that area, and it's probably related to Persia, Egypt, and earlier civilizations, and they didn't write as much down or express themselves so openly because a lot of this was sort of secrets and things. Not mystical as opposed to rational, not non-functional, but they We're hesitant often to write things down, more so when the Greeks talk about that and then just blatantly write things down like savages who are recently literate. Yes? Yes, all of us, again, are primordial savages, yes, in this economy. So while Socrates first asks us to imagine a city ruled by desire, the stomach, but devoid of courage, the heart, or wisdom, you can't see my tummy, with the camera, won't change the angle, but basically the stomach, the heart, and the head are desire. I'm going to get a burrito later. Yes, for I desire it, and then I have a burrito, and I no longer think nor want one. Yes, emptiness. You have here, and openness, enlightenment. You have here the stomach, desire, emotions, spirit, courage, honor, something like all of those in the chest, and your heart pumps, and you're like, for battle, and you hear rousing music, and your lungs breathe. And then you have the air and the fire, the heat and the breath of the body. When you die, it seems to go upward or outward, and the earth and the water go downward into the soil. Ancient people observed this, and in Hawaii, we have people talking about earth and water, and you can read between the lines in there. They would just assume, well, you're dealing with life, so yeah, parts of the chicken go up, down, sideways, and they're observing all of this, and they're symbolizing basic elements, saying fire, water, elements of their life that are highly important and useful. Water, fire, torches, drinks of water, everything. And so, yeah, they're symbolizing this, and it is really, you should, whether or not you like it or believe it or not, I mean, you should think this is what he's decently saying here. But I don't mean that we think fire and water are basic elements on the periodic. Fire is not an element on the periodic table. It's a form of energy. And again, I honestly will let others interrelate that for you and pass along in silence like Confucius here. What we're going to talk about, I'm going to tell you whether you like it or not, or you think it is or isn't modern science at all, or whether you think this is pre-rational or not. I don't. I think the Hawaiians are rational and trying to do stuff with chickens in Hawaii with these kinds of systems. Plato is talking out elements as they did in Egypt, and he thinks they did quietly and esoterically amongst themselves and the priests. And he is trying to rather bodily talk a little too much and show us Pythagorean secrets here. In fact, the Republic and the Timaeus are one of the best sources of Pythagoreanism, not Pythagoras, because we don't have texts of Pythagoras. We have quotes about him and said of stuff. I'm not even sure if it says that he wrote anything down himself or authored works. I'd have to double check my stuff. That's one of the a loose thing in my head here. But I come from the Haight-Ashbury. People get all New Age and also Old Age about Pythagoreanism and Egypt and aliens and a lot of stuff. I mentioned last time. A lot of that, no matter what you think, a lot of it comes from this text in the Timaeus, and then we say that's Egypt because that's what Plato and Pythagoras sort of said. And Plato, this is one of the best texts for ancient Pythagoreanism and ancient Egyptian stuff, because a lot of the Egyptian stuff is either lost, non-translated, or they didn't say it out loud. So a lot of people who get very esoterically, and have since the 1800s actually, as New Greek texts started to be translated, and white people got more and more into being Greek rather than Roman and Catholic, as in the 1700s and 1800s, white people started to get much more wealthier than the rest of the world, but also turned Protestant. They started getting very into being Greek, and as they did, they identified a lot or not, and part of that is not only the spiritualisms and the cults and the Masons and all of the stuff, but you also have people getting esoterically into things like aliens, spirits, forms of elements and things, and a lot of New Age stuff. I come from, again, countercultural land. A lot of New Age stuff and a lot of counterculture you find, and spiritualism, is based partly on the Republic and the Timaeus because there aren't Pythagorean and Egyptian sources so much. For better or worse, whether or not we've translated everything or the Vatican's sitting on texts or not, and people say a lot of things, of course, and I'm not going to be all conspiratorial or weird here. It's just, the facts and substance and unfortunate circumstances of life that everything isn't translated or known, or may lie buried still. I've heard there have been new discoveries in Egypt. Egypt is still, for the Japanese and everyone else in the world, the most dug up place in the world, and they're still digging things up, So we're going to dig up a lot on Egypt here with Plato, In fact, the Timaeus, he's like, so 9,000 years ago, and again, in our current understandings, much love to Egypt, 9,000 years ago is a little early, you know what I mean? For stuff like what Plato thinks of as Egypt, he doesn't know that. He thinks that Egypt is 9,000 years old, as far as he knows. So Aristotle also says the Babylonians watched the stars for an absurd amount of time, well over, I think he says something like over 100,000 years. And it's like you and I don't think in modern folks that the Babylonians were around that long. Aristotle doesn't know. He thinks they were, which again is good evidence. The Greeks did not think they were the first scientists in the world. They thought the Egyptians and the Babylonians were rather impressive and never used the Latin word scientia, I guess until Greco-Roman, interactions, etc. All the context is, again, in my ranting. So, Socrates says, first imagine a city with desire. This would not be a just place, and everybody would grab for themselves, and the city would fall to destruction. Socrates adds the police guardians, the polis, and the police must keep their own desires in check, so they are heart people, he describes. They have courage and they have strength. They have emotional honor, and they are like courageous, and they have fire in the heart. And so they're above stomachy people who are kind of wormy people who are just like, well, I'm just going to build buckets. It's like, no, I'm a courageous warrior. So they're higher than the workers, and they should be put higher in the caste system of the city, Plato says. And he doesn't say India, but he says this is how Egypt does it. These aren't slaves. These are like common people who didn't fare all that great in Egypt or Greece, honestly, in any era. Lastly, he says, then you have the philosopher priest, because, and he draws all of this out, sometimes your stomach is thirsty, but your heart is too proud to drink, or you understand that it's poisoned. So you can defy the hunger or the thirst of your belly with your courage or honor or fear, or with your intellectual capacity to reason, no, wait, that's poison, don't drink salt water, etc. Even though I am thirsty to the point of madness, I'm not going to drink salt water because I know better, or I'm afraid of it in the heart. And Plato lays this out, and he says, and that's why, much like in a better city, or an ideal one, he even says, but a better one, which would be better than what he thinks he's in, clearly is what he's saying, you would put the workers on the bottom, the cops and the guards above them, which is not a controversial idea in the slightest at this time. And in fact, that there be some cops over people, regardless of people's issues and stuff, is oftentimes just assumed. But then you would have the intellectuals and the brainy people rule the heart people, rule the stomach people, and he argues, you can see that our desires are different from our emotions. My passing desire for a burrito is different from my honor. I will not eat burritos, because I am not really better than that at all, honestly, but imagine that I don't know why, I have this fear of burritos, therefore I'm like, no, and then I have intellectual, now wait a minute, my heart's being rather foolish and being rather headstrong, wouldn't be that for Plato, right here. And so you would have the reasoning ruling the emotions, ruling the temporary desires. This also resembles permanence, oneness to manyness. Notice you can't see all of me, I am a tree branching downwards from oneness to manyness. Plato says in the Timaeus, we are a plant with our roots in the heavens, stars many coming down, and now I'm a plant physically outward above the ground, but downward into mitoses, Moses supposes. And you're not only a oneness to manyness, you are also a permanence of an idea and form of a horse. Here comes the form, which is important. There is the idea of a horse. We will have a lot of wrestling with this in Parmenides. That is most wonderful. I do think, as do many French folks, that the Parmenides is the most brilliant philosophically of Plato's texts. The Symposium is the most dramatic and the most brilliant drama, but it is the Parmenides, which is the most brilliant philosophically for the French and myself. I will get to why that is and not this when we get there, which we're going to do this, the Timaeus, and then the Parmenides. And that'll get us close to the end of Plato and then to Aristotle. So that is Plato's Republic in a very small nutshell there, hopefully triangular. It's yes, chestnuts, I don't know. That Socrates, chest, yes, head nut, nut case, walnut factory, head nut speaking, I believe is how to eat like a child. So Socrates adds the philosophers on top, and he says this is how the Egyptians did it. Now, Socrates, for whatever reason here, as Plato, seems to believe, and Timaeus also follows here, that Egypt puts intellectuals on top as priests, rules themselves by effectively scientist philosophers, and then they rule the cops who rule the people. That's the best possible society, really, I think, is what he ends up saying. The threefold division corresponds to the head, heart, and stomach. And it does quite blatantly. And here, you see fire in your eyes through the eyes, you get breath through the mouth into the chest, and you get food down through the mouth into the food, and the water goes into the stomach. You wouldn't have to cut anybody open to know that all decently. And again, you find ancient systems trying to keep track of basic elements like that. As a more functionalist, kind of anthropology-minded guy, whenever you look at a culture, it's like, well, that's highly irrational. What are they saying carefully, and look at it in context, and a lot of times you will see why would they, even if you and I would not do that symbolically, why would they do that, in that sort of circumstances? Well, they're trying to explain the head, the heart, and the lungs, and they're trying to explain fire, water, and earth. So they would be lining, and the stars, which look like fire, so they would be lining it all up together. And I love to go on and on about this because people really still don't get it. This is one of those things where people got this since the 70s. The 60s and the 70s was a time when scholarship could ask new questions, particularly. People got into this and then kind of petered out, and people didn't really pay this much attention. And we still go on and on about the West and the Greeks. What about the rest of interconnections with civilizations? Well, the scholarship will get funded someday better, I imagine. Well, I don't imagine that. Hopefully we can realize it better, rather than merely imagine. All the people, yes? So the heart or chest is air as an element, spirit, breath, and courage. Spirit often is something like emotional and has to do with words and jerking people around with words a lot in humankind. So the heart is the spirit, is the breath, is the words, and then you're like, well, now wait a minute. Even though words are up here in your head too, they're very much here and have to do with emotions also, and then that has to do with possibly mathematical forms above human emotions and words. All this is loose in Plato, but you can definitely see it. And then Plato's like, come to my grad school classes and I'll teach you more. Oh, by the way, I got to go to a trial and see a man about a horse. Thanks, pal. He tells us a lot more than that in a lot of texts, but he ultimately doesn't. So how do you reconcile math of Pythagoras with the all is one of Parmenides Buddhistically, buddy? Well, like the Egyptians, he saved that for silence as far as you and I. Great. Well, that's problems and problems and problems. Russian dolls and Russian dolls and Russian nesting. Yes? So the hands and stomach, notice grasping the material put into the mouth, is earth as an element, desire, craving, and thirst in the individual, and workers, farmers, and craft people in the city. The individual, city, and cosmos form a continuum. Notice that authority and the good, again, come from above, evil and chaos from below, which is why Plato is no Democrat and actually far from a modern Republican. Socrates also frames this in terms of the individual person, and I've already ranted and raved about that. I have in the notes more about all of this. Again, Plato and Aristotle were not fans of democracy. They really do think you need fewer leaders. And Aristotle does say if you can't find one good guy, get a few good guys, but don't get too many. And here, as I mentioned, it did astonish me, but I was amused that I did find that Lewis Carroll, I love doing work about Lewis Carroll, was very nervous in the 1860s and 70s about giving all white men who don't own property the vote. And it was with the Civil War in America, and just after that, and then just after that in years for Britain, that all white men of the proper kind of Christianity were given the vote in the mid-late 1800s. You can look it up. Lewis Carroll is afraid of that as a open-minded, somewhat progressive, somewhat conservative guy who likes caring for the poor and women more and advocates that, but is afraid, for complicated reasons, of giving white Christian men like himself the vote if they're not property landed people and he's a low-level noble, which is why he can be an academic in the mid-late 1800s, be a bit literate. So yeah, that is not only literacy in mathematics is rare enough in humankind, not necessarily the structure Pythagorean or otherwise of the universe, but not for the peasants in Siberia or otherwise monitored by psychologists. If the Siberian says, well, does 6 + 5 always work? Because I can't fit that many cats in a wheelbarrow. If you're like, yes, it does, they haven't been trained in math classes to get a biscuit every time they get the test right. So it's meaningless to them for abstractly 5 + 6 to always equal anything because it just doesn't fit in a wheelbarrow. That's closer to the Piraha, and they're having no math between us and them. That would be mostly peasants, who would never have the number 32 in their minds or lives for anything. You know what I mean? If we look at it that way. Technically, the tree has 4,001 leaves on it, whether or not you count them. But from another way, it doesn't have 4,001 leaves on it mentally for you anywhere. How would it? If you're just staring at it. Although there are some who would suggest almost like you're making secret calculations in math you are not aware of. But that would be a strange sort of Pythagorean Freudianism I do not engage in. Oh, thank you. Good day, sir. Yes. So, ranting and raving about mathematics and forms of the good and whether or not this is a part of the cosmos above us and Plato and the mortal sphere, like my empty stomach devoid of burrito. Socrates says here, and this is the point, and now we come to what effectively is the answer for Book 1. If you don't keep your ducks in a row, because it's not clear, why are you talking about a city all of a sudden? We're talking about a tyrant, and why the shape of the city? Because if you don't have the philosopher, priest, or god emperor for Aristotle, and nice guy, or guys fewer up above, who is not the individual tyrant, who's grabbing all the gold and the dancing girls for himself, you're going to have the tyrant fall off like many did in Athens, and 30 tyrants, 30 days. I don't know what plan that is, and I'm not paying for it. But essentially, you would have people fall off and on, and then it's like, because that's tyrants in China and in Greece. If you have jerk tyrants, they come and go. So what's a stable emperor already is a very major political question in Greece, China, and plenty else. Who's a stable chief? And as things get more technological, they get more patriarchal, it definitely seems to anthropology. So who's the guy? Who's the man? Again, sitting next to the man. The piccolo player? I don't think so. And yeah, it's that you want a solid state drive, yes, and to drive you to all things, including build ladders below and ideas above. Theophanies of the gods. Like sort of spiritualists. These guys definitely think the priest philosophers are conduits to ideas, and ideas are higher spirits above us, and Thales says all things in the cosmos are full of God. So these guys are actually divining rods, and what they're doing at the pinnacle of the pyramid is they are allowing the great ideas, which are not just in your mind, but in the communication of the gods to you, and the ideas in the above and the mental is coming down through the physical mental. And so they are conduits for the ideas and for the math, which is not in human minds or practice. No. It is, as Platonic mathematicians would tell you even today, no matter what else they believe, above your head in the cosmos and in its DNA itself. Anyone who talks like that, like the cosmos has to be mathematical, is decently enough a Platonist. And I'm not. I'm a Wittgensteinian. We won't get that for a couple lectures yet, I gotta tell you. But I work it into almost everything, as I am taking too long here. So I also mentioned, this also gets political. This set of lectures on the Republic, as well as some of Aristotle, I can use and will for the social political philosophy class, Philosophy 2. And that's because the Soviet Union and America have both claimed to be the Greeks and claim to be the West. Even though Russia likes to say they're West and East and that's superior, they still consider themselves white and Western, plenty. And although Eurasian, but they are not identifying so much with the Chinese as much as Europe, a la Christianity, Russian Orthodox, and other things. So the Soviet Union says, we're the Greeks, we're more Plato's Republic than anybody. Who told you otherwise? And unfortunately, an American or two who distrust something like the Soviet Union would have to, insofar as Plato, Popper says Plato invented authoritarianism, which is hilariously wrong. Try anthropology or once or twice, fallible science man. Is that Plato did not, and nor did Hegel, invent authoritarianism, nor did Marx. Regardless of what you think of Marxism, the Soviet Union, or what Marxists think of the Soviet Union, which is several things. That you could, it's fascism. That's right, kids. Just like capitalism, everything is fascism. Again, Foucault says you have to fight the inner fascist in all of us. During the Cold War, according to the Americans, communism is fascism. And according to the Soviet Union, capitalism is fascism and or feudalism. And both ain't the Nazis. In fact, both got together to fight the Nazis and then fought each other afterwards. So good luck with our intellectual priest philosopher scientists above, including Sidney Hook, who argued in the Sidney Hook thesis that if you're a communist, you're biased towards communism, therefore communists can't do true, pure mathematical science as they're racing the Ruskies into space. And the Russians faded from history and are gone now. They don't influence anything. Yes, we know this. So, the American scholars, America is a bit more Aristotelian. Plato sounds like he's trying to run a commune, a bit dictatorially, although it is somewhat a union of unions, and the idea is you vote the plumbers up the chain and then they get to vote on top and through everybody, but that, an American would see that as rather authoritarian and fascist a bit. In the communism. And the same, of course, and similarly, Aristotle says, well, you need to balance a little bit of the public and the private. I don't want to be so extreme as much as Plato, my teacher's Republic, he seems to say very much. Not exactly in those words, but very much. But Plato seems to want more of a pure commune and something like a Catholic monastery, but something where, well, yes, all the children are raised in common, oddly enough. I guess like orphans. So Plato's ideal city is impossible in the real world, he suggests, but he does suggest like we push towards that. Soviet Union says, yeah, we're more that than you, with the Cyrillic language, and actually who gets to be the Greeks officially is a political matter and influences how people talk about the Olympics and how people propagandize everything. And of course, propaganda is, of course, not an evil conspiracy. It is mere mortal PR. You know, we are the PR empire. We have attorneys, we have spin. And of course, with all this stuff, to get out of the politics, the same politicians and the politicians, the cops, the executives, and the corporate people, and in Argentina or otherwise, all go to the same corporations now for PR. So if you think it's an evil conspiracy by one side or the other, no, people are taught how to spin, and they're professionals, and they pay taxes. You know what I mean? It's not a conspiracy to spin everything as hard as you can your way and pay for it. I mean, it's propaganda, but it's not an evil conspiracy that's masterminded by the Rothschilds. It's human nature, know thyself. Yes? Or somebody else, rather than you. That's more pleasant. So Socrates says, speaking of which, the ideal republic, in that every person has one job. You had one job, as the meme goes. Now this actually, Musashi, the Japanese samurai, says you should have more than one job, and every single thing, a tea ceremony, painting, teaches you how to be a better swordsman. So you have a primary job, which is being a swordsman as a samurai, but do tea ceremonies because everything builds on everything. I like that a whole lot more, and I am more Wittgensteinian than Platonic or Pythagorean, because Plato thinks you are working your way into the triangle, so if you make ladders, and you don't, I guess, there aren't laws, you can never play the violin, I hope, but you don't play the violin as part of your profession because you are a ladder builder or a violinist. Which both are effectively craftspeople, stomach people. Violinists are not heart people, warriors, nor are they intellectuals. A ladder builder and a violinist would equally be, for Plato, some artist craft person. You'd be part of the stomach lower level. And you would have one job so that it works for everybody best. If you're best at the violin, we test you as a kid, you are now a violinist, and maybe you grow to you're a better bucket maker later. Well, Plato doesn't really see that as possible, it seems. That's a serious problem. He then here gives the cave, and of course we are going to focus here and end up with the cave, and we will leave the rest of the Republic, unfortunately, for plenty of other people as we go along to focus on the main ideas of Plato's other dialogues, which is me moving into the Timaeus. As I've already ranted about, I know a bit about the Timaeus and that guy who comes in, and the connections are something fierce and amazing for the ancient world, for Indian, Greek, Chinese thought all over the place, and for the largest cultures on earth, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, which were major conduits for ideas, at least Christianity and Islam, but also Buddhism, for these kind of Greek and Indian ideas, and that's why in Tibet and Tibetan stupas you can find these order of elements and symbolic shapes and things like that, which is not a conspiracy, but human culture and practice. In all kinds of amazing ways. And then the Chinese have like 5 instead of 4 elements, but actually the Tibetan prayer flags are the order and colors of elements. I have some I won't turn the camera to outside, because those colors in the Tibetan prayer flags are the sequence order of elements. I'd sit here and remember them and quote them off. It's like green is water, blue is void, that's the top one, white is air, and I'm screwing it up. But like yellow is earth, yellow is associated with earth and people in China, and then red is fire, etc. And I gave those totally out of order, but that's actually the Tibetan prayer flags are in the order of ascending elements of the cosmos. Like Plato's Republic, the Tibetans. That's not aliens, that's human culture having spread around the world, and we still praise the Greeks as the only scientific people, and we do not interconnect them academically with the Egyptians or the Tibetans, because we're idiots since the 70s. It was the 70s, you know what I mean? I blamed them, of course, and not myself. So he basically says we have to lie to people. He says, let us tell them a Phoenician, not a Greek, not a Western, a Phoenician, the traders who actually their alphabet comes by way of the Romans to us, and we don't speak Greek, nor Phoenician, I suppose. Phoenicians are also people who gave purple dye as associated with royalty, and they were at the end of the Silk Road trading through people with India and China, which is why they were merchant seafarers of the ancient world who were famous sailors like the Greeks, and were thus respected by the Greeks as seafarers. He says, let us tell people the noble lie, like the Phoenicians tell, that people are born from the earth, and there are 3 races of people, like Noah's sons, and there's been weird things about Hamites lately we will not get into here, although I'm glad to rant about all that. There are 3 races. we're going to lie to people. Say there's 3 races of people. There's gold, silver, and bronze. Where have you heard that before in anything Greco-related? Yeah, that's a more modern recreation of ancient Greco-Roman forms, which it's a racial lie, honestly. That's a great thing to be motivated by. The metals of gold, silver, and bronze flow in the veins of specific people. Now, this is not related to the color of their skin, because what we do for Plato is we mix up the children in common, and then he doesn't talk about various shades of hue of people, actually, and here we could imagine mixing up the Greeks amongst themselves. And he says we mix up the people, we raise all the children in common, rather communally. In fact, he does imply, like, you don't have your particular parents, and that would be better for everybody to be impartial and not so stomach desirey, dividey many, versus oneness upward by having the children all served by the same adults at the same breakfast tables, and you don't really know who your parents are. Aristotle would be weirded out by this, like Republican Dad and Confucius, who says to Mozi in China, and Aristotle says to his teacher Plato, I want me to have my particular bucket and family a bit, but yes, they would all be like, no, we communally are all together with the emperor and communal and stuff. They're not communists for being that way in the ancient world, but they would be like, and that isn't the origin of individuality or private property either, because of course people were in balancing acts about this. And some people were like, let's radically get into Plato and Mozi of China, and then Aristotle and Confucius like, let's have some balance. But we're going to tell people a noble lie, and then we're going to say they're all assigned these jobs, and then they are decent. Plato seems to assume so you are a worker person, and you can get tested for that, but then we also have to lie to you and tell you that you have special veins and a heart. So then the interlocutor says, now you're so amazing, Socrates, and I've been saying yes the whole time like a yes man. Again, Confucius says, Yan Hui displeases me. Everything I say pleases him. It's like, yes, Confucius, yes, Socrates. So somebody stops, he's like, now I know you're right, Socrates, and you're amazing, but just slow down here and explain to my stupid self why you're right, because I don't know that yet. Why do we lie to people if you're right here? Why do we have to lie? And it is here that you find the cave. Now, as I have mentioned, and others have critiqued before me and mentioned this, people often hear the cave and they snip it out and they put it in a reader, and then they say, oh, wow, we're a democracy, you want to rise up, and it's like become a better sort of person in the whole communal thing. Plato's cave is very brutally authoritarian. It is justifying everything I'm telling you, whether or not you think that's the Soviet Union or not, or Mozi of ancient China. And because of that, Plato says, well, because the people are too stupid to learn from their betters and me and what I'm telling you. See, they actually are 3 different kinds of people. The stomach dominates, or the heart, or the head. He thinks that physically and medically. He thinks there's head-dominated people and hearty people, which is sort of weird phrenology, but not just in the brain of ancient Plato here. It really is. And so it would be physical and mental, like your heart is bigger or something like that, like you're a cow, or you have 4 stomachs or something. Yes? Although not that, hopefully. Plato would be weirded out. But you essentially have people who are, the people will not believe this. The stomach people are too stupid to know they're just stomach people medically. So we're going to lie to them and propagandize the whole situation because people aren't smart enough. No, the majority of any populace, he implies, but the Greeks, but anybody, because he likes the Greeks, and the Athenians specifically, that most people are just incapable of much science, philosophy, truth. Plato believes that, which means we have to lie to and propagandize the most of society. He says this. No, and I have students be like, oh, and that's why society is the way it is today. Well, there's human instincts, and Plato is not telling everyone in politics to lie for the first time, nor do politicians need to read the Republic and be like, my God, we can lie to them. Nor do I think politicians just go out there, lie blatantly, and think, well, I'm just lying for the purpose of lying, haha. But regardless of all of that, this is where the cave comes in and the matrix. Whoa. It's like, why are we living the lie? Well, because we need to, for the majority of us, because we're just not capable of being noble enough to accept truth of philosophy. Sort of unfortunately, I've been yammering here, oh, well, when the heck are we going to wake up and not be all desirey and prejudiced and realize, hey, India and Greece are all similar, and with scholarship, you could read that decently into that. It's like, well, when will we all wake up? And then, of course, if I was like, well, we never will. So the few people who can understand, like me and Plato, that we should compare Greece with India, they should rule the rest of the people who are just going to be too dumb and racist, I don't know. So up in academia, and of course, I am not a right-winger saying that's the conspiracy. It's interesting, of course. It's like we all would say, especially right-wingers, there are betters, let's place them above us, and really we should trust them. That's certainly, that is a right-wing and, of course, a left-wing thing. As I like to mention to my students, and it's appropriate for social and political philosophy, do you go into a hospital and then if the doctor came out to the waiting room and says, who thinks this guy has strep throat? Anybody? Come on, democracy. You'd be like, could we have a little bit of authoritarianism here? I want your special educated medical opinion. This isn't a vote, Keep that in mind, not as far as we're fascists. Foucault says we have to fight the fascists in all of us, hence. Keep in mind how authoritarian we always are, and we kind of want chieftains and wise, we need wise Latinas, yes, in the Supreme Court, which to me means white men are ignorant, that's how I interpret that. Basically, of course, we want our wise superiors, so you don't want every idiot, that's actually, unfortunately, why Lewis Carroll was not so much the egalitarian or the anarchist. He was afraid of all white men voting if they didn't own their own house, and they rented an apartment like I do, thanks rent control. Truly, it's like, Lewis Carroll would be weird about me voting, yeah. So of course, many of you would be too, given this rant. So, I will vow to vote as needed. So essentially, Plato says this won't be perfectly just and ideal, but this is the city in which the police and philosophers will be least greedy, many would object, or unjust to the people below. As I like to say, unfortunately, we have a view of humanity now where if I told you people who do math all their lives or music theory, they are the nicest people, not crazy, weird narcissists living in closets, and we should just put them above everyone. Much love to math and music theory people. I'm a nerdy person myself. It's like, do we want the folks who are focused on math and music? They can do gymnastics for Plato. They need to be somewhat bodily people, oddly. They need to rise above the level of guardian, so they can't just be pure, girly, nerdy people, according to Pericles. Us Greeks, we acquired learning, but we haven't lost our manliness, is what Pericles says. Spit, into the ancient spittoon, platoon, splatoon. I don't know. I wasn't there. But basically, Plato says, no, this is how the Egyptians did it. This is how in Thebes, a den of Thebes. And where they should elevate priests as a class. And that's what we should do with the philosophers. And Socrates says, by the way, feed me for life. Of course, he said right before they X'd him off. As Plato's audience should know if they're season ticket holders. He also says to imitate Sparta. Why? Well, they don't have intellectuals. They're dummy-dums, but they actually put their courageous warriors above others, so put them over them. Then you gotta have the intellectuals over the dumb warriors, because, of course, they're heart people. They're hearty, like a breakfast full of bacon for 50s doctors in the advertising, PR Nation. And then the word hearty, which means lots of bacon and milk, actually doesn't mean good for your heart anymore, because that's what it was in the 50s in advertising campaigns that hired doctors to say so, who probably believed it as experts, along with the meat council. And that's what they wanted to think, and the money was flowing, This is why we put our experts above ourselves, and then they know everything about the heart, the mind, and the body, yes, and what's good for all of us in the inner flow of society. On the capillary level, as Foucault would say. So if you put your desires and appetites in check with your feelings, and your feelings in check with your reason, you will be a well-ordered soul individual city. And then cosmos, when the seasons are in the right time and there isn't a weird squall in the winter. The appetites crave, the spirit is passionate, and the mind is reasonable. These have their jobs, the single thing they do best, their purpose, in you as an individual, whether or not you're a piccolo player. Socrates argues that sometimes we are very thirsty. But again, we can know it's poisoned, or be proud and not have another beer, wine, as such. And so he walks through all of that, as mentioned. So in the Apology, though, Socrates says he should not be condemned to death, but given free food and life because he's helping Athens out. But then when he angers the assembly, he says he must drink the poison and die. All of that, as mentioned, isn't consistent with itself. And actually, in the Republic, we now have a new Plato who's rather Pythagorean, telling us things that don't perfectly line up with all of that, though we won't get into the weeds. But clearly Socrates is being presented as a philosopher who should be fed by others so he can continue to reason, and an individual who can drink poison as the wisest and best course of action. He is clearly being shown as that, and that is consistent. Socrates suggests banning all art. Unfortunately, this is also the Soviet Union a little bit. Music, poetry, and theater. They would not actually all the time say they're banning it outright. Of course, that's not what they would tell you. They would say they are, very much like in America, we're encouraging the best of things and we're actively helping them. We're not censoring or cutting back on the bad, is what a lot of people would tell you regardless of form in their words. And then you would say, but those aren't your actions. That all art, which is not, and think about it, you have to be a violinist and not a bucket maker. all art which is counterproductive to the good of the city, the communal good. This does sound a bit communistic to an American in the Cold War horse here. Still going. Everything that isn't impressing the highest good and order should be X'd. This is exactly like I always like to mention. I like the Surrealists of Paris. They would go trying to hang out with the communists and other countercultural types of Paris. You had better believe Paris has communes and communists and communism a bit and the socialism-y. Yes, it's a little socialism-y in France, I think. So basically they have socialism and communism as two different parties of their six for a two-party America. And so when the Surrealists of Paris of the 20s and 30s and 40s were like, hey, like, let's come, we want to do weird stuff like Dali. Technically, he was kind of a Spanish fascist. We want to do a lot of weird dreams and Freud all over the place in weird, embarrassing ways. And the communists of Paris and France are like, we're kind of into brute realism. You know, we not only think communism is science and is a science, and we're doing objective truth a la Marx, whether or not you believe that. Marxists double down on, we are science, not religion, pal. You know, we're not Egyptian priests, but we are the mathematician intellectuals. And by the way, and we raise those above the plumbers. Wittgenstein famously went to Russia, supposedly, and it's in Wittgenstein the movie, which is an amazing, terrible play, like Plato's dialogue. And he says, I really want to work with my hands. And the Russian commissar woman is like, let me tell you how the Soviet Union works in hard socialism. You are math logic god person. You're not going to be a plumber, pal. You know, and then he leaves and he doesn't defect to Russia. You know, he goes back to Cambridge. Is that... Yeah, no, this is more sort of the Soviet Union a little bit, and an American idea of it. But again, Plato's saying this happily. And when you see like Lenin holding like up a trowel or something, that's brute realist style. When you see old style Chinese communist propaganda posters, and it's happy people, doctors and lawyers going to the future, that's old style propaganda. As opposed to new style propaganda. Experts say, with the British and Americans and the news sources, experts say, and some experts said, and an expert said, it's much old school, old world to be like, and the king says brush your teeth. Scientists say you should really have 9 out of 10 brush with crest. That's on the packaging. It's like, it's much more second wave propaganda nowadays, very British and very American, to run it through news or run it through somebody or the expert said or this journalist said or somebody who was better placed said. Regardless, I don't want you to think it's all conspiratorial. It's just culture. It's much more old world to be like an old school and Eastern Bloc. To be like, we're standing for the thing. This is good for the people. Socrates as Plato is basically saying, no, you don't want surrealists getting mixed up with your communists. Like, then they do decadent, rich boy, dreamy Freud crap. Like, and that's not good for feeding the people grain, is it, you dinks? You know, he very much is saying something like that. So it's totally appropriate for me to fling the word communist around, you know, kind of weirdly as an American here. Regardless of, again, we are somewhat abstaining judgment here. I'm not. I'm getting all passionate. But yeah, it's without endorsing or trying to demonize either capitalism or communism right here. It's that, yeah, like he definitely seems like a Soviet realist or something. You can see those art styles. And at that time, America got into abstract minimalism with Pollock, which was a counter move, specifically. And it gets really weird. People have come out with interesting info about that and don't get too conspiratorial rather than just historical. You know what I mean? Nowadays? Yeah. So the youth are to be taught. This is Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, why are we teaching people? He says Homer and Hesiod should be beaten as if they're criminals. The architects of Greek culture. The great poets. Why? Because they tell people the gods are thirsty for blood. Gods are purer than you and I. They're better people. And then he doesn't want us to be so anthropomorphic like Xenophanes, oddly. But in a certain sense, why would the gods lust after battle? And Plato here says, get rid of Homer, get rid of Hesiod. Here he's exactly in step with Heraclitus, possibly early Socrates. Although he wants, actually, early Socrates seems to want to annoy Homer and Hesiod, you know, up in the Elysian fields, doesn't he? At his trial, anyway. Here, oddly, Plato turns Heraclitus, but probably more Pythagorean. No, the gods are like math or like triangles. They're not sort of, they wouldn't try to go around boning swans or anything like that. Like, Zeus is a terrible dad. I don't know if you knew this. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, he's not an all-knowing Jehovah, Yahweh, you know, like as some sort of, which was an old storm god on Sinai, and then increasingly stops getting angry at Adam, and increasingly is all is true in more monotheistic rather than polytheistic Israelite times, as the Israelites are telling themselves, stop being polytheistic, be more monotheistic like the Persians, like the Egyptians with the more solar monotheism. Talk more like that. Plato and Heraclitus want us to talk more like solar abstract monotheists. They don't like Homer and Hesiod telling us the gods get horny and then start clubbing people to death. Like, that's for idiots, and we're going to ban that, and we're going to refuse to let the youth learn that. Censorship of Homer and Hesiod. Why? Because we want the youth, the most of them, to be mathematicians as much as possible. And then plenty of them are going to be more bucket makers and violinists. You know, again, into the spittoon urn here. Again, if you want to be a great violinist or bucket maker, you got to earn it. You know? I'll show myself out. Yes. So, yeah. After being questioned about lying, why are we lying? Well, see, it's kind of like there's a cave, Socrates says. The most famous moment of the Republic, and there's like a matrix or something all around her. I do like from the old, that's a little more Valley Girl than Keanu Reeves. Is that essentially, yeah, it is, I do always like from the critic, again, if as Romeo, young Keanu pre-fame, is like, if you prick us, do we not bleed? If we are nauseous, do we not blow chunks? Again, thanks to the writers of the critic. And yeah, you have here, whoa, it's like a matrix, and we're all in a computer, you know, with a book by Baudrillard in the beginning, like it's all postmodern Plato. Like, well, the Wachowski brothers, then siblings, then sisters now both. Actually, they put a book by Baudrillard in a Plato-like internet cave of sorts, which tells you they know French postmodernism a bit and some ancient Greek Plato in the Matrix as the architect of all that. Yeah, well, the architects, yes? So, you have here that, imagine, Socrates asks, everyone is chained in a dark cave, watching shadows of puppets carried by a fire at the mouth of the cave. You never learn exactly who are the ones who carry the puppets, others have stated. And it's weird. You don't ever learn. People pop off and out of the chains like the old Mac commercial, and they step back and look at everybody chained up. But they don't ever look and see who's carrying the shadow puppets. And it's sort of like we are ourselves in our minds kind of showing ourselves and chaining ourselves up. So in a certain sense, there aren't kind of extra agents, sort of. But again, Plato leaves that part kind of out. The people think the shadows are reality, the real things. Those who escape, which is a smaller number, break the bondage of appetites and earthly things, like Buddha in the Lotus Sutra says we're trapped in a burning house, some of us make it out, and then they are fascinated by change back and forth. But the Buddha and the few who make it beyond being fascinated by change like philosophers, one thing becomes another, they smile on all equally, no matter if you're a criminal or a murderer or anyone, with the slight smile of the Buddha, nice and calm and tranquil. Not enthusiastically Buddy Christ happy Buddha, calm and tranquil because nothing actually changes. Cave changes, nothing actually changes. In Plato, who is very different from the Buddha, you have trapped in the house, in the shadows of the lighty cave, burning housey thing, which is false and terrible and desire, with the Buddha. You then have breaking out of it, you have the fire, and then people are somewhat with emotions. Oh, look, one thing with the duck rabbit, you love it, you hate it, you love it, you hate it. Hey, I can show you lots of angles here, kid. But if you keep going beyond that level and you're like, look, I can show you the duck rabbit from one way, from the other way, you know, sarite. It's like then you get out of the cave further and you get up with Plato with pure math and you realize, oh, nothing actually changes. All these things are shadows. As Bodhidharma says, real truth is wisdom. Passing mortal forms are shadows. But for the Buddha, you gain a tranquility which is all accepting and kind of Parmenidean, which Plato seems to want to preserve, and he doesn't know the Buddha probably at all. In fact, the Buddha lived before Plato, but probably, and how much, and people still speculate, how much was Buddhism anything? People thought it was Heraclitus. Similar thinker. But again, with all of this stuff, with the Buddha, you would smile on everyone no matter if you're a jerk or you're kind, because I can see the cycles, and I know you're a jerk now, but your karma and what you are physically and mentally will circle around. You'll feel bad later, so I don't have to tell you anything if you're a jerk right now, because I can see the cycles and see nothing really changes if I'm seeing the whole Zen circle of everything and paying careful attention. But for Plato, getting out of the cave is distinctly not going from skepticism and openness-mindedness, oh, everything is everything plenty, and then I can make the angles when I need to, pragmatically. For Plato, you're getting out of the cave, and you're not just gaining total acceptance of everything one way or the other on the duck rabbit, you are gaining Pythagorean mathematics and the form of the good, which increasingly seems rational and mathematical. Although he wants to preserve his Parmenides, and so once we get through the Timaeus and the Parmenides, we are then going to have, and it is hard to know exactly what dialogue goes where, but that is why I placed the Parmenides right after that, because then we're going to have Plato trying to be Parmenides and kind of Buddha, which isn't all going to fit comfortably, but it's awesome to go through piece by piece. That is where we will stop. Again, I do have some people say, oh, but the line and other things from the Republic. There are many fine things to do in the Republic. I actually do concentrate on these ideas for several classes, not only because they dovetail with Buddhism and Indian thought and Chinese thought so well and all sorts of things, but because these are the most famous thoughts of the Republic, and because all too often people do not slowly go through other dialogues of Plato that reflect on these points and clip the cave out. And yes. So we conclude with the cave and its open mouth, and hopefully today you somehow make it out into the sunshine, a bit, then go back in the cave, then out in the sunshine tomorrow a bit, take it easy. As Plato says, you go out into the sunlight. At first you are blinded, but slowly you start to see the real things and realize that those were shadows and mere semblances of forms. Lower, like hair and mud for Plato, are barely formed because they're messy, chaotic, physical material things. But the higher forms of light, oddly enough like shadow puppets, are the forms itself, rather Pythagorean, mathematical, and proportioned, fractioned, therefore ratioed and rational. Whether or not we need to do math or fractions to become better people is going to be something which Plato endorses in the Republic, and I will leave to Timaeus the Pythagorean next time. So much happiness, make it out into the sun as you can, endure squinting at the sun if you can, and much happiness.